In the late 70s, a 15-year-old girl disappeared after accepting a ride from a stranger on a quiet California highway. What happened next would shock everyone and become one of the most mysterious true crime stories. How does someone survive something so awful? And what really happened in that remote canyon? The answers are darker than you might imagine, and you're about to find out in this video. Welcome to Unmasked, the channel you come to hear the shocking and the believable. Yeah, that was a mistake. Looks like you're paying attention. Let's get into it. In 1978, Mary Vincent was just an ordinary 15-year-old girl living in the small town of Lafayette, California. It was a time when hitchhiking was still common, and young people took off on adventures, heading out to find new places and make new memories. Mary had big dreams. She wanted to travel, to see the world, to live a life filled with excitement and opportunity. She never imagined that one decision, one small moment, would change the course of her life forever. On September 29th, Mary decided to leave her home and head down to Southern California to visit her mother. With only a small bag and her thumb raised to hitch a ride, she started walking along Highway 132, a stretch of road that ran through the quiet outskirts of the town. It was a warm day, the sun high in the sky, and the highway was relatively empty. For Mary, it was just another day on the road, but she couldn't have known that she was about to encounter a nightmare beyond her worst fears. Her abductor, a man named Lawrence Singleton, was driving along that same highway when he saw Mary. At first glance, he seemed harmless, a middle-aged man in his early 50s, dressed simply in a shirt and jeans. He appeared like any other person on the road, perhaps someone who was just going about their day. But behind his eyes, behind the surface of his ordinary appearance, lay something far darker, something Mary could never have anticipated. Singleton pulled over and offered Mary a ride. At first, everything seemed normal. They exchanged small talk about the weather, the usual pleasantries you might expect from a casual conversation. There was no sign, no warning bells ringing in Mary's mind that the man in the car was anything but safe. After all, this was still a time when people didn't always fear those who stopped to help. They trusted each other, or at least they trusted enough to hitch rides with strangers. But what Mary didn't know was that Singleton was hiding a dark past, one that would only begin to unfold as this story progresses. He had been previously convicted of a violent crime, a fact that remained hidden to Mary as she sat in the passenger seat of his truck, unaware of the dangers slowly closing in around her. Singleton had a long history of disturbing behavior, but none of it was known to Mary when she climbed into his truck. In that moment, everything seemed too ordinary, too comfortable, and Mary couldn't possibly have known how quickly that would change. As they drove further from the main highway and onto a less traveled road, Mary's sense of unease began to grow. It wasn't much, just a subtle change in the air, a small hint that something was off. But it was too late to turn back. The scenery shifted from suburban neighborhoods to more isolated areas, and before Mary knew it, they had turned onto a dirt road that led deep into the hills. She felt a chill run down her spine, but she tried to brush it off, telling herself that maybe she was just overthinking it. What Mary didn't know was that just days before, another incident had occurred on that same stretch of road. A local woman had gone missing, and no one had connected the dots. The same highway, the same area, but no one thought to make the connection. No one was looking for Mary yet, and her disappearance would be buried under the weight of a case that had yet to reveal its true horror. It wasn't until much later that investigators would learn that Mary's abduction wasn't the first. It wasn't even the last. But for now, as the truck rumbled through the hills, there were no sirens, no search parties, just Mary, alone with a man she thought she could trust, but who would soon show his true nature. As the truck continued deeper into the canyon, the world outside grew quieter, more isolated. The sense of danger, once just a passing feeling, became more real with every turn. Mary had no idea what was coming, no idea that she was driving straight into the darkest chapter of her life. And that's the terrifying thing. When you're young and innocent, you don't see the threat until it's already too late. September 29, 1978 was the day that forever changed Mary Vincent's life. According to news reports from that time, Mary, a 15-year-old girl, was hitchhiking near Berkeley, California. She was trying to make her way to Los Angeles to visit family. Like many teenagers back then, hitchhiking was a common means of getting around, and Mary wasn't alone in trusting strangers on the road. Lawrence Singleton, a 51-year-old man, pulled up in his van. Witnesses described Singleton as appearing harmless. He told Mary he had a daughter her age and simply wanted to help her out. Mary, tired from the journey, accepted his offer, and they started their drive. The drive began uneventfully. According to Mary's later testimony, Singleton was polite at first, making small talk. However, she soon noticed a detour. Instead of heading south, Singleton had taken a different route, veering off the main road. Mary confronted him, nervous about the change. Singleton reassured her, saying he needed to make a quick stop at his house, but promised to get back on the highway soon. As the miles wore on, the roads grew emptier, and the once populated surroundings turned into barren canyon roads. Mary's sense of danger grew. Later, she described feeling trapped and unsure of what to do, but she had little choice at that point. She felt a strange unease, but she tried to stay calm, hoping that his reassurances were genuine. What happened next was corroborated by physical evidence and Mary's own recounting of that horrific day. According to her testimony, Lawrence Singleton pulled over and got out of the van, claiming he needed to check something. At that moment, Mary saw her chance. Her sneaker was untied, and she thought that if she stepped out and ran, she might escape. But before she could act, Singleton attacked her from behind. He struck her with such force that she fell to the ground disoriented. Mary later told investigators how Singleton bound her wrists and threw her into the back of his van. He tied her up so tightly that she couldn't move. The evidence found later confirmed her story. Marks from the ropes were visible on her skin, and her clothes were torn. Singleton drove deeper into the canyon, away from any signs of civilization. The details of the next hours came directly from Mary Vincent herself. She spoke of the brutal assault that lasted for hours. Singleton repeatedly violated her, keeping her tied up and helpless. She later testified about her attempts to reason with him, to plead for her life. But Lawrence Singleton showed no compassion. He kept her there, in the middle of nowhere, isolated and terrified, with no one to hear her cries. As dawn approached, Singleton made a chilling decision. As Mary would later recount in court, Singleton coldly told her that if she was released, she would report him, and that was something he could not allow. He took out a hatchet and, in a calculated move, severed Mary's left arm just below the elbow. According to medical reports and the testimony of hospital staff, Mary was in a state of shock when she later described the moment, "Dear goddamn, I can't feel my body." The pain was unbearable, and she could barely comprehend what was happening. Singleton wasn't finished. He took her right arm next, leaving her bleeding profusely. After this vicious act, he threw her body down an embankment, believing she was as good as dead. Evidence from the crime scene would later reveal that Mary had been dumped in a remote area near Del Porto Canyon in a concrete culvert. There, Singleton left her, expecting her to bleed out. Meanwhile, Mary Vincent's disappearance was a nightmare for her family. The young girl, just 15 years old, seemed to have vanished without a trace after hitchhiking near Modesto, California. The investigation that followed was riddled with confusion, chaos, and dead ends, many of which only deepened the mystery of what had happened to Mary. The California Highway Patrol received the first reports that Mary had been missing when she failed to make contact with her family. The initial steps were straightforward. Authorities began combing through the local areas where Mary was last seen. However, there was no sign of her, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. They reached out to people who knew her, but her friends were just as bewildered as everyone else. At the time, there were very few leads. The detectives working the case faced a huge challenge. Hitchhiking was common, and it meant that Mary could be anywhere, taken by anyone who had driven along that highway. According to old records, early interviews with potential witnesses didn't turn up much. Many drivers had seen hitchhikers along the highway that day, but none could confirm Mary's whereabouts. The initial investigation turned cold quickly. They searched for her along the highway where she was last seen, but there was nothing to indicate where she had gone or if she had met someone dangerous. There were no obvious clues, no cries for help reported, and no visible evidence to guide them. The California desert, the endless roads, it was all too vast. And then, things took a confusing turn. According to case records, a report came in about an abandoned vehicle found not far from where Mary had been picked up. Investigators thought they had their first real lead. They examined the vehicle, thinking it might belong to the person who had taken Mary. The car, however, turned out to be unrelated. A vehicle reported stolen and left by joyriders. It was the first in a series of frustrating dead ends that plagued the investigation. While investigators scrambled to find leads, time continued to slip away, and with it, hope of finding Mary alive. The longer she remained missing, the grimmer the outlook became. The few people who had seen her that day described her as being with an older man in a van, but none of the witnesses could provide a solid description. The clues were too vague, too generic, and every tip seemed to lead nowhere. Detective reports from the time mention how the case slowed to a halt. The investigators were left with hardly any information, a few vague descriptions of a blue van and an older man, but that wasn't enough. And then, everything changed when Mary herself reappeared. On October 1, just 2 days after she was left for dead, Mary Vincent was found, barely alive, by 2 Good Samaritans who happened to be driving through Del Porto Canyon. According to interviews later conducted with the rescuers, the sight of Mary stumbling along the road was something they would never forget. They saw a young girl, naked, covered in blood, and missing both arms. It was a sight that haunted them long after that day. Mary was rushed to the hospital, and her fight for survival didn't end when she escaped her attacker. She had lost over half the blood in her body, and medical staff later reported that her willpower to survive was nothing short of incredible. She gave a detailed statement to investigators while still in her hospital bed. Her determination to identify her attacker became the key that broke the case wide open. Based on Mary's description, a police sketch artist quickly worked on a composite image of the man who had attacked her. Mary's memory of Lawrence Singleton was clear. His features, his voice, everything about him was etched into her mind after the nightmare she endured. The sketch was then distributed widely, and it didn't take long for someone to recognize the man. Lawrence Singleton was a known figure to his neighbors. A merchant seaman by trade, Singleton was described by those who knew him as solitary and sometimes erratic. The authorities received a call from someone who recognized the sketch, someone who knew Singleton and had seen the news of Mary's attack. With this tip in hand, the investigators finally had a name to work with. Singleton was located at his home in San Pablo, California, and brought in for questioning. When confronted with Mary's statement, Singleton claimed he was innocent. In fact, during his first round of questioning, Singleton told a wildly different version of events. He insisted that Mary was a sex worker and that she had tried to extort money from him. According to court records, he portrayed himself as a victim, arguing that Mary was trying to rob him and that he had acted in self-defense. The investigators, however, didn't buy Singleton's version of events. The evidence found at the scene, coupled with Mary's own vivid testimony, painted a completely different story. Investigators discovered bloodstains in Singleton's van that matched Mary's blood type, further confirming her version of events. The van itself was a traveling crime scene, containing tools and evidence that showed clear intent. When Singleton was finally arrested, Mary was still in the hospital. According to court documents, Mary faced multiple surgeries and grueling recovery procedures, but she remained steadfast in her resolve to see justice done. She wanted Singleton to be caught, to make sure he would never be able to do this to anyone else. As the case moved to trial, Lawrence Singleton continued to claim innocence, maintaining that he was the victim. The public was outraged when more details of the case came to light. Journalists at the time reported on how Singleton seemed calm and unaffected by the horrific charges against him. But as the courtroom saw Mary Vincent herself take the stand, the tide shifted. Mary's testimony was a pivotal moment. She recounted in detail the events of that night, how Singleton had overpowered her, tied her up, and driven her out to the canyon. She spoke of the assault, the hatchet, and how she had fought to stay alive. Despite her injuries, Mary stood before the court, looking directly at the man who had tried to kill her. The bravery she showed was something that made headlines across California, and many people followed the case closely, horrified at what had happened, but in awe of Mary's strength. But Mary Vincent did not give up. Against all odds, she somehow managed to regain consciousness. In later interviews, Mary spoke about her sheer determination to survive. She used what remained of her arms to push herself up, packing dirt into her wounds to slow the bleeding, an act that would later be described by medical professionals as nothing short of miraculous. She began the painful crawl up the steep embankment. Her strength was slipping, but she managed to reach the road, her body covered in blood, her spirit refusing to give in. According to police reports, it was by pure chance that Mary encountered help. Two men who were out driving saw her as she stumbled along the road, barely able to stay on her feet. Horrified by her condition, they immediately stopped, wrapped her in towels, and raced her to the nearest airport, where an ambulance was called. Mary had lost over half the blood in her body, but she was still alive. At the hospital, Mary worked with a sketch artist to create a detailed drawing of her attacker. Based on her description, police were able to identify Lawrence Singleton. The accuracy of the sketch was incredible, especially given the trauma she had endured. This likeness led to Singleton's arrest shortly after. In the courtroom, Singleton faced multiple charges: attempted murder, rape, and kidnapping, among others. During the trial, which was covered heavily by local news outlets, Singleton maintained a lack of remorse. In a shocking move, he claimed that Mary was a sex worker who had threatened him, a statement that was not backed by any evidence. Mary faced her attacker in court, testifying against him with a level of bravery that left many in the courtroom speechless. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Lawrence Singleton received a sentence of only 14 years, the maximum allowed under California law at the time. Public outrage grew as news of the light sentence spread, leading to changes in legislation. Many believed that justice had not been served, especially since Singleton would ultimately serve only 8 years before being released for good behavior. Singleton's release was met with widespread protest. People feared what he might do, and tragically, those fears were well-founded. In 1997, Lawrence Singleton murdered a woman named Roxanne Hayes, proving that he remained a threat to society. The leniency he received allowed him to take another innocent life. The investigation into Singleton's past revealed even more troubling details. According to various reports, Singleton had a history of violent outbursts and troubling behavior. Neighbors spoke of his temper and his often erratic demeanor. It became increasingly clear that Mary Vincent was not the first person to encounter Singleton's dark side. In court, the jury listened as Mary's story unfolded, each detail more shocking than the last. Medical examiners testified about the nature of her injuries, describing the horrific ordeal that she had survived. The evidence gathered by the police, the blood in the van, the rope used to bind her, and the tools found in Singleton's possession all supported Mary's account of what had happened. Eventually, The jury found Lawrence Singleton guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. But despite the horrific nature of his crimes, the sentence handed down was far less than many expected, just 14 years, the maximum allowed under California law at the time. Public outcry followed the sentencing, with many arguing that it was far too lenient for a man who had committed such an unthinkable crime. Mary Vincent's ordeal did not end with the conviction of her attacker. Reports from that time described how she worked tirelessly to move forward with her life despite the trauma she had endured. The community rallied around her, but there was also a deep sense of frustration with a justice system that seemed to fall short. The case of Mary Vincent versus Lawrence Singleton would later become a turning point, leading to changes in how violent offenders were sentenced in California. After Mary Vincent's incredible fight for survival, Lawrence Singleton was arrested and brought to justice, but there was more to Singleton than anyone initially knew. As investigators began to peel back the layers of his life, what they found was a dark and twisted history that painted a much clearer picture of the man who had committed such a brutal act. It was during this phase of the investigation that a pattern of lies, manipulation, and violence began to emerge. Lawrence Singleton had portrayed himself as an average man, a father, a seaman, someone who lived a quiet life in his neighborhood in San Pablo, California. But the truth was much darker. As police began to interview neighbors and acquaintances, it became evident that Singleton's life was far from ordinary. Neighbors spoke of his temper and how he would sometimes act erratically. There were whispers of his violent tendencies, things that those close to him had either ignored or had been too afraid to confront. According to neighbors interviewed at the time, Singleton had always been a solitary man. He worked as a merchant seaman, often leaving town for extended periods, which kept him away from the public eye for long stretches. During those absences, few asked questions. It was this frequent movement and transient lifestyle that may have helped him evade notice for so long. The investigators soon uncovered that Singleton had a history of legal troubles, and these weren't minor incidents. Court records revealed a pattern of aggressive behavior. He had a history of alcohol abuse, which seemed to trigger violent outbursts. This information was part of what investigators pieced together to understand the man who had attacked Mary. The more they learned, the clearer it became. Lawrence Singleton wasn't just a man who had suddenly snapped. This was someone with a deep, violent streak. Someone who had been a threat for years. Investigators also began to suspect that Singleton's attack on Mary may not have been an isolated incident. According to some who knew him, Singleton often spoke with a disturbing disregard for women. Reports gathered during the investigation suggested he had a history of misogyny, one that seemed to go unnoticed by those around him. The investigative team, led by the Modesto Police Department, began to suspect that there could be other victims. Singleton's transient lifestyle, his frequent time at sea, and his habit of moving from place to place painted the portrait of a man who was always on the move. Someone who could have easily committed other crimes without drawing attention. As they dug deeper, they found unsettling evidence that suggested Singleton's violent behavior wasn't new. There were unconfirmed reports of women who had gone missing in areas where Singleton had previously lived or worked. Although there was no direct evidence linking him to these cases, the similarities were enough to raise suspicions. Detective Sergeant Ken Gross was one of the lead investigators on Singleton's case. For Gross, the case took on a personal weight. In interviews after the trial, Gross talked about how he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Singleton's story. He described feeling haunted by the gaps in Singleton's past, those periods when he would disappear for months at a time. Gross once remarked that there were too many blanks in his history, too many times when we just don't know where he was or what he was doing. The police also spoke with Singleton's ex-wife, who had divorced him years earlier. Her account of their life together painted a troubling picture of a man prone to explosive anger. She described incidents in which Singleton had threatened her and their children. She described how sometimes he would flash his death glares at everyone and how often he demanded satisfaction from kids. She described incidents in which Singleton had stepped in to hold him accountable. It seemed that those closest to Singleton had known he was dangerous, but there was never enough evidence to take action. During the trial, more of Singleton's character came to light. His defense team painted a picture of a troubled man who had struggled with alcoholism, trying to argue that the attack on Mary was somehow out of character. But those who knew him told a different story. A story of a man who had been a threat for years, someone who had harbored dark tendencies that were finally coming to light. As Mary Vincent testified, the court saw firsthand the stark contrast between her bravery and Singleton's attempts to discredit her. Throughout the proceedings, Singleton showed little remorse. According to journalists covering the trial, his demeanor remained detached, even cold. He continued to claim innocence, maintaining that Mary was lying, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. The emotional impact of the investigation wasn't limited to just those who worked on the case. Mary herself carried the weight of Singleton's actions long after that night in the canyon. She spoke openly about her trauma, about how she faced nightmares and struggled with the lasting effects of the attack. Her courage was evident not only in her survival but in her willingness to face Singleton in court, to look him in the eyes and ensure he was held accountable. Her testimony, raw and powerful, left a mark on everyone in the courtroom. Detective Gross, reflecting on Mary's ordeal, said, "She survived something that most people couldn't even imagine, and she did it with a strength that few possessed. She became the key to bringing him to justice, and she never backed down, not once." The impact of Mary's courage wasn't lost on the investigative team. It pushed them to dig deeper into Singleton's life to ensure that no stone was left unturned. The more they looked into Singleton's background, the more disturbing details they uncovered. He had managed to keep many parts of his life hidden, using his transient job as a seaman to avoid scrutiny. It turned out that Singleton had lived in multiple states, often leaving abruptly without any explanation. Authorities began to contact other jurisdictions, trying to piece together Singleton's movements over the years. They wanted to know if there were other cases, other victims, who had crossed paths with him. What emerged was a picture of a man who had lived his life in the shadows, someone who had evaded consequences time and time again. There were reports of domestic abuse, complaints filed by neighbors about his erratic behavior, and suspicions that had never been fully investigated. Singleton had slipped through the cracks, hiding behind the guise of an ordinary man. But now, his mask had been torn away. Mary's testimony in the subsequent investigation into Singleton's past brought these dark secrets to light. But the question remained, why had it taken so long for anyone to see the real Lawrence Singleton? Why had it taken such a brutal attack for the truth to finally be revealed? In the end, the investigation into Singleton wasn't just about bringing him to justice for what he did to Mary. It was about exposing a lifetime of violence that had gone unchecked. It was about ensuring that his past could no longer remain hidden, and that the system would recognize the warning signs that had been ignored for far too long. Lawrence Singleton's trial and conviction marked the end of a long investigation, but it also raised important questions about how someone with such a dark history could evade accountability for so long. It forced law enforcement to look at how they handle cases of domestic violence and how easily dangerous individuals could slip through the cracks if no one was willing to dig deeper. Mary Vincent's courage brought Lawrence Singleton's true nature to light. Her strength, her willingness to fight for justice, meant that his past was finally laid bare for all to see. The dark, hidden truths of Lawrence Singleton were no longer secrets. They were exposed for everyone to understand the danger he posed. Mary Vincent's recovery was not just about mending her body. It was a long journey of trying to rebuild her shattered spirit. After the attack, Mary faced countless surgeries, and doctors fought tirelessly to stabilize her. She had lost both her arms and with them, a part of her independence. But Mary's fight for survival didn't end in that canyon. It carried on in the hospital room, in the courtroom, and in her daily life. In interviews years later, Mary spoke openly about the challenges she faced after the attack. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was the emotional weight of what happened that truly lingered. The terror of being attacked, the sheer cruelty she endured, it haunted her every day. She learned to use prosthetics, she forced herself to go on, but there were nights filled with nightmares that wouldn't let her forget. She was forced to confront the reality of what had happened over and over again, something that most people couldn't even fathom. Mary Vincent, however, chose to be a voice rather than a victim. She stood up in court against Lawrence Singleton, and after his shockingly short prison sentence, she became an advocate, pushing for changes in laws that would prevent others like Singleton from being let out early. Her resilience sparked change, but it also highlighted just how flawed the system was that allowed a man who had done something so horrific to serve such a minimal sentence. But even after Singleton's conviction and subsequent release, lingering questions remained. How many others had there been? Singleton had lived a transient life, moving across states, working as a merchant seaman. How many times had he harmed others and walked away without consequence? Reports from investigators hinted that Mary might not have been his only victim. There were missing persons, unresolved cases in the areas where he had been. Could there have been other victims? People whose stories would never be told? The question of motive also loomed large. Why did he do what he did? There was no clear reason, no explanation that could ever justify such cruelty. Was Mary a random target, or was there something else that led Singleton to commit such a brutal act? These questions remain unanswered. Mary Vincent's story is one of unimaginable pain, incredible strength, and resilience in the face of true evil. But what do you think about this case? Do you believe justice was really served when Lawrence Singleton received just 14 years for his crimes? And could there be more victims whose stories were never told? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below what questions still linger for you about this case, and do you think our justice system has changed enough since then? If you found Mary's story as powerful and inspiring as we did, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts. And if you're hungry for more true crime stories that reveal the chilling realities of the world we live in, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. We've got more cases that will keep you questioning and wanting to know more. Our next story involves a chilling mystery that's still unsolved, an eerie disappearance with clues that seem to lead nowhere. You won't want to miss it. Stay tuned, and as always, stay safe out there.